The context now we go into, the high context culture versus the cold context, low context culture, where individually we'll just chat to one another, whereas the high context there's bowing and raising of hats and so if a culture has been around for hundreds of years, it may be quite formal. There might be quite a few rules and traditions, and how one should behave is understood by those brought up in the country. And I'd say probably China and Japan for sure, and Korea is quite high context culturally. I think Japan has a lot of rules which are unsaid but are understood, and Korea's the same. There are many in Switzerland, and a couple of them when I was in Switzerland is you don't do your washing on a Sunday, and nor do you mow your lawn on a Sunday. So they told me those quite early on, just so I knew not to do a load of washing and hang it out on the line on a Sunday, because it just wasn't done, and no one would be mowing the lawn and making a noise with the machinery. Most of the shops, if not all, are closed on a Sunday still in Switzerland. So they really celebrate the Sabbath still. If you show the soles of your feet to a Muslim, it's highly offensive. And if you go to a Muslim country, you may need to wear a headdress if you're a woman, especially. And men and women might not mix together. Whereas in the more cold, cultural, low context, we all mix together, men and women. And when I was last in Malaysia, we weren't allowed to wear anything sleeveless, the women especially, even though the Chinese Malays would wear sleeveless. We had the Chinese Malays, the Indian Malays, and the Malay Malays, and it was offensive to the Malay Malays, so we had to think of that. That was interesting, whether you got so many different cultures all coming together. And so we wanted to set an example for that. So in the high context, who you are related to and who you know matters. Whereas in the low context, who you know might matter, but not as much. But what you know is much more important. And in the formal, more high context, it's much better to be overdressed than underdressed, which is some of the reason often for dressing, specifically for doing our preaching and teachings, because if we're going off into a hot climate culture, we need to be thinking of overdressing rather than underdressing. In the cold climate, we're not really so offended by underdressing. We're not offended if someone turns up in a t-shirt and a pair of shorts, whereas in a hot climate culture, there would be a real offence of that in a situation. And so this kind of lack of protocol isn't dishonouring. It doesn't mean that they're rejecting. You don't reject someone because you happen to turn up and you're not dressed appropriately. Whereas how you respond in a situation and how you behave needs to be appropriate. Otherwise, it's dishonouring in a high context culture. And if it's too casual, then you're really insulting them. which is why it's so important to understand when we're going into a high context culture, because otherwise, rather than bring the gospel, we're actually bringing kind of insults to them. And so what we can do is ask local people. Really, part of the research paper is really understanding the customs, understanding the culture, understanding the history, knowing what we're going into, understanding the manners, respecting the rules, talking to someone from that culture, and giving attention to appropriate greetings, and leaving our own rules at home if we have them, and really entering into the rules of and culture of the nation we go to, which is applicable to every culture we go to. And in the cold climate culture, we might address people by their given names rather than their title, unless it's suggested. In England, we have traditional tea, and we might have sandwiches and cake, and the tradition is it would be at 3:30 or 4, but now it can be quite confusing, because if someone invites you for tea, you don't know, if you're an outsider, you don't know what they're asking you to, because tea could be a cup of tea, or it could be a formal tea at 4 o'clock with tea and cake and sandwiches, or it could be high tea or tea, which is a proper dinner like we have down at the depot at 6 o'clock. And if someone asks you for tea, unless you know them, you don't know what they're saying. And I recognise that because of our background, we are much more low context culture now, but because of our hierarchy, we were quite high context culture. In the city, everyone would have worn a bowler hat, walking stick, umbrella, walking stick, and a briefcase. I'm not sure that's still the same now. Any stories?
Yeah. On the full other side of that, in Australia, like, it would be rude to call some of my teachers by Mr. and Mrs.
Right.
I knew almost all of them by either their first name or a nickname.
That's interesting. That's really low context, isn't it? Yeah.
So that was the way that we interacted. We had nicknames for teachers, and they responded to it. And it's rude almost to call someone Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or whatever. It's known as like, you call me by my first name, or you call me by whatever nickname that's pretty good.
In South Korea, if it was your birthday and you went out to eat, you were expected to pay for the dinner, because it's good. If it's your birthday, it's good luck, and so you're sharing your luck with all your guests. And then I think they would buy the cake and bring it, but the guests would bring the cake or something.
Yeah.
Or you go out usually. And then in Mexican culture, you have to invite somebody out to eat. You're expected to pay because you're inviting them. And so, but if with Americans, they kind of lend it. On my base, it's not like that case, you know. I'm thinking like this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Whereas I'm thinking, if in the UK, if everyone goes out for dinner and they're all chipping in and paying, then they might cover the birthday persons. Would that be the same here?
In America, yeah. Typically, you would have a friend or a couple of friends kind of chip in to pay for the one that has a birthday.
Time and planning, hot versus cold, which we kind of touched on a little earlier. But the hot climate culture, you're just talking to someone on the way. It's relational, that's more important. There might be some kind of time and planning, but it's not what is the same as the cold climate culture, where I found this time-orientated, task-orientated, how to make better use of your time. We can be very task-orientated and time-orientated in the cold climate culture. When I was in Malaysia some 30 years ago, I went to see a James Bond film. And it was in, I guess it was a cinema. It was their version of a cinema, not quite like this, more like a big hall. And there was a big balcony as well. And it was going to arrive, it said it was going to start around 11 a.m. So I turned up with I was traveling. I turned up with my other people I was traveling with. And we got our tickets and we went in a bit before 11. And there wasn't really anyone around. We noticed that our seats were numbered and it was right at the front. So the screen was enormous and then we were right at the front. And we thought, yeah, this isn't great seating. We might want to go up on the balcony. So we went up and we just sat in the balcony. And because there weren't many people around, and we just chatting and chatting. And then slowly a few more people came in, and then a few more people came in, and we realised that we didn't know when the film was going to start because people just kept kind of slowly coming in. And it was probably 1 to 2 hours later when eventually it was just heaving with people, really full. And some people came up to the balcony and you could see them looking at us and kind of talking to one another, and I realised, oh, we're in their seats. But they weren't going to ask us to move. I think in a cold climate culture you'd go and say, you've got our seats, please can you move? They weren't going to ask us to move. And so they went and they found someone else, and they probably talked to someone who found them some other seats somewhere. But by the time the film started, every seat was taken and it was completely full. And so the time that the film started really had no it was when everyone was there. And then when it started, I've never heard so much noise. The amount of, it was pretty loud, the movie had to be loud because the amount of loud and relationship going on while the film was being played was enormous, with cheering and shouting. It was a real event. And you wouldn't get that in a cold climate culture. It's very much the film starts on time, and if people are chatting to one another, someone might say, we're watching the movie, can you be quiet? But this was a whole community thing, that they were all involved in the chases, and they felt it and they went into it, and kind of experienced the whole thing together. So in the hot climate culture, they're not as orientated towards time as in the cold climate culture, which is more structured in their approach. And they enjoy using time efficiently. So often we will have allotted times of when we're going to go and have fun or play, and a lot of times of when we're working and doing other things. Whereas they're more kind of event orientated. When I was in India, I went to a wedding and I had an Indian friend, and I was like, when does the wedding start? And he was, it's fine. And the wedding started, and I was like, don't we need to go if we're meant to be going? No, it's fine. In fact, we actually turned up after the celebration and when they were all eating, but no one seemed fazed by it. And he went and chatted to the bride and the bridegroom, and I was there, and it was very different. You wouldn't, in a cold climate, you wouldn't turn up to a wedding halfway through eating the food. You would have gone to the ceremony as well. In hot climate cultures, they respond to what life brings. So what happens, and they will respond accordingly. Whereas we're more planning our day and saving time, as I mentioned. And saving time is not as important as experiencing the moment in a hot climate culture. So you're experiencing every moment, you're being part of the event. In Africa, you can go to dinner and turn up, hours late, and that's just normal. You wouldn't turn up on time. And sometimes there is a time thing. So if someone says we're meeting at 8, you know that it's an hour later. So recognize that structure is required in some areas of life in a hot climate culture. There will be some structure in the military, for example. But yeah, that's probably, there will still be some hot climate culture within that. Yeah, in the cold climate culture, if you have an event, it will start at the time that it says. Might be a bit late, but not completely late. Any questions or comments or stories about that?
Just remember being in South Africa and the whole now, and it really all of them meant anywhere from now to an hour from now you'll be doing things.
Yeah.
There's just no concept of time. Supposedly now, and now. I mean, they all had 3 different time frames to it, but in reality, it really did. It was all just anywhere from now to an hour.
Yeah.
So you just have to, we'll do it eventually.
And what does now mean? So what does now or soon mean in a certain culture? So if you're in a traffic jam, say, and someone says, if there's a roadblock or something, and someone says, you talk to the person who's by the roadblock, when is this going to be moved? And they say, oh, very soon. What actually does that mean when he says very soon? Does that mean 1 minute? Does it mean 10 minutes? Does it mean an hour? What does very soon mean? What was interesting though when I was in Tanzania is going off 4 hours into the outback to really this tiny village, and it had a church, and we were going to, as a DTS, they were all going to teach what they'd been taught on the DTS. So it was all throughout the week, and they were going to preach on the Sunday. And I went and talked to the pastor there, and he gave us a time-stamped schedule of 9 o'clock, such and such, 9:05. I mean, it was absurd. And I said, we can't stick to this. And it was just, I thought he must have come from an Anglican background or Presbyterian background or something, whereby someone had taught him to be so structured. And I just wondered if this is how he ran his church, because it was so alien to what I thought, and really interesting. And when people preached, all the elders were sitting on the stage, and then all the congregation were sitting on stools and benches and things. But it was interesting talking to him about that time thing, because generally in Africa I didn't see that.